Her fault. Her fault. Her fault. Her fault. Her fault. Her fault. Her fault.
Go on. Do it.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Goldberg from the New York Times, and I am outrageously thrilled to be here with the visionary and renowned writer, Margaret Atwood.
Thank you.
Okay, so The Handmaid's Tale has always been, in certain ways, a kind of prophetic book, but right after the election, even before the series, people really started gravitating towards it, right? It shot up bestseller charts immediately after the disaster of November 9th, and and since then, I mean, obviously the TV series has been spectacularly successful. It won the Emmy for Outstanding Series. Protesters wear Handmaid's Tale costumes to signal, their kind of rage at oppression. What do you make of all that? I mean, what do you make of the book's contemporary relevance? And do you see it as being kind of relevant to what's happening in the West right now?
Am I going to say no? Oh, yes, it's been quite strange because the people in the show, which started shooting in September 2016, woke up on the 9th of November and said to themselves, we're in a different show. Mm-hmm. It's not that anything in the script changed, but the frame changed so that people were going to see it differently. Did I foresee that in 1985? No, I didn't. I thought we were moving away from that, not towards it. Mm-hmm. But it was always a possibility in this country because there have always been people who took that view in one way or another. Going back to the 17th century Puritans, not a democracy, by the way.
Right.
Not a democracy. So the people woke up on November the 9th. We're in a different show. And I think, if anything, they became more dedicated to it. This is a group of people who are very invested in the show. It's not just a job for them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one reason that it's been so good. You can tell that. They're a very talented group of people, and they're giving it their best.
Right. I mean, one of the things that's so eerie watching this show now is the flashbacks, where things are actually sort of normal, but also changing in subtle ways that nobody can quite believe, and nobody quite knows how to handle them. And suddenly, people can say things to you like that they wouldn't have ever said before. You said, we think of progress being a straight line forever upwards, but it has never been so. You can think you were being a liberal democracy, and then bang, you're Hitler's Germany. I mean, how scared are you? We were talking backstage, and you were saying, well, things could be a lot worse. So how scared are you about the rise of right-wing populism all over the world?
All over the world or here?
Well, here, but
Okay.
what's happening here is part
Yes.
of something happening
It
internationally.
is, but let's talk about here first.
Okay.
The United States is very big.
Mm-hmm.
You may have noticed that. And it's very diverse. So I'm not giving up hope on it yet. and neither are a lot of people living in it giving up hope on it yet. And that's why you see such increased political activity, such pushback. So that's a hopeful sign. And they haven't yet started shooting protest marchers. That's always a bad sign when they
Right.
start doing that. They have tried to enact some pretty strange laws here and there, but those have not always succeeded. So I see it as a moment like this, you know,
Right.
two opposing forces, and we're not in the Handmaid's Tale yet, or I wouldn't be sitting here and you'd be in jail.
Right. So speaking of two opposing forces, I mean, where do you think we are in the fight for women's equality? I mean, you're at a place like this, and it seems like there's all these powerful women, and you know, the future is female. We have this, you know, despicable sexist ogre as president, the most famous philosopher.
You're not mincing
I was going to
words.
say the most famous philosopher in Canada is this guy Jordan Peterson, who says, you know, well, maybe women and men can't even work in offices together.
He says a lot of other pretty weird things.
Yeah, where are we going?
So here's a hint, just a hint. People aren't lobsters. Just to begin.
Google that.
We can start there. People are actually not lobsters. So what do we make of that? I think what we make of both of these phenomena is that there was a number of people out there who felt they weren't being heard, or who also might have felt that something that, quotes, ought to have been theirs was no longer just automatically available to them. Mm-hmm. And then they're willing to follow people who promise to give them that thing back, or to provide that thing for them. So I think that's one of the things that happened with both Trump and Jordan Peterson. But Jordan Peterson didn't become famous until people tried to shut him down. Mm-hmm. So that's another lesson.
Yeah.
That's another lesson.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you actually have you've fallen afoul of, you know, not just kind of the right-wing backlash, but of some feminists, purists as well.
I don't think that feminism and human rights ought to be on opposite sides of the fence. Because if you...
And do you think they are
In certain circles.
Mm-hmm.
In certain circles they are, but of course feminism isn't one thing. It's about 50 things.
Right.
So in certain circles, human rights are viewed as some sort of disguise for male empowerment. But if you actually look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's pretty favorable to women, because it views women as people. How radical. Mm-hmm. So they aren't on opposite sides of the fence, and they shouldn't be on opposite sides of the fence, because as has often been said, human rights are women's rights.
But do you think that that's what's I mean, you've said, you know, you've talked about the terror and virtue phase of a revolution.
No kidding. Yeah, I think you see some of this going on in certain sequestered parts of society, such as certain universities. Mm-hmm. But I think they're moving through that, and let us hope they'll come out the other side and realize that if you develop a tool like that for shutting people down, the next people it will be used against is you.
Right.
And that is...
Okay, and that's about as good a seg as I can imagine to the clip we have here from The Handmaid's Tale, which I mean from the first season of The Handmaid's Tale, you know, about how quickly any sort of curtailment of human rights can be
like that
used against
if you're willing to shoot people. Mm-hmm. Can happen very fast. So what are we going to see?
They were dirty women. They were sluts. But you are special girls. Fertility is a gift directly from God. He left you intact for a biblical purpose, like Bila served Rachel. You girls will serve the leaders of the faithful and their barren wives. You will bear children for them. Oh, you are so lucky, so privileged.
What a great actress.
Oh, she's terrifying.
I know she is. She's channeling my grade 4 teacher.
Is it strange as an artist to see, I mean, the first season hews fairly closely to your book, but now it's about to branch out in all of these different directions. Is that a strange thing to see as an artist, to kind of create a world and then have other people run with it?
Well, once in a while it happens to books that they escape from their covers and take on a life of their own. So we see a picture of Scrooge. We know who that is, especially if it's at Christmas time. So he's a character who has escaped from his book and gets put into all sorts of other narratives, sometimes to get you to buy things. But I think the Handmaid's Tale has escaped from its book and is being reinterpreted not only by the television series, but also by its readers. So this movement of dressing as handmaids and going and sitting meekly in legislatures or just standing outside, it's quite brilliant because nobody can throw you out. You're not making a disturbance, you're just there.
Right.
And anybody looking at you knows what that means. They may find it irritating, but they can't actually do that much about it. And this has gone... This has gone around the world, but it started, guess where, in Texas. It started in Texas, and the women who decided to do it sent away for the outfits thinking that it would be red, and when they arrived, they were pink. So they said, we have to do something about this. So they very quickly devised patterns and sewed those things themselves. And then they put the patterns online so that anybody else who wanted to do that could do it as well. And this has popped up in all sorts of places, including Poland and England and Croatia, and just here in Ireland, here and there around the world, particularly at friction points where governments are trying to either withhold human rights legislation for women or take away rights that women already had.
Now, The Handmaid's Tale, I mean, it's a lot of things, but it's really, a parable about, among other things, reproductive tyranny. What do you think is going to happen as you have plummeting birth rates in Western countries all over the world, coupled with rising xenophobia? I mean, it seems like a recipe for really forcing women back into these roles as...
That's been tried. Mm-hmm. I put nothing into The Handmaid's Tale that had not already been done. So it's been tried in several places, most notably in Romania under Ceausescu. And he mandated that women had to have 4 children. He mandated pregnancy tests every month. And if you weren't pregnant, you had to give a reason why, if you could. It was him. But it meant that all these women who couldn't afford them were having too many children, and then they were ending up in orphanages, and a lot of people jumped out the window. So it is really cruel and inhuman to force women to have children if you're not going to give them the money to do that,
Right.
And then you're not going to give them any money to bring them up. What is that a recipe for? I'd say it's a recipe for despair and death.
Is there anything that you can say about season 2 of The Handmaid's Tale? I mean, I saw. Well, no, I'm not. I'm asking this not just because of my own personal countdown to April 25th when it debuts. I was able to, as a prize for doing this interview, see the first couple of episodes, and they were really brutal. Yeah, where do you see this story going next?
We don't just say brutal. We say brutal and riveting.
Yes. That goes.
This is a team that is extremely invested in the show. They're sticking to my main rule, which is nothing goes in that has not already been done somewhere, someplace. So all of those things need to be researched. They need to, if the writing team comes up with something, they need to be able to show where it came from. So they are very dedicated, and they're not pulling any punches. Some people said about the first season, well, it's so beautiful. It's so lush. The photography is so wonderful. The colors are so attractive. And the showrunner said, well, we have this idea of dystopias that they're always sort of grim and full of dust and sand and things like that. He said, that's not usually the way things are.
Right.
They're often very nice for some people. It seems to be the point of them.
Although in this one we see a little bit more of a kind of classic
we're going
dystopia.
we're going to the colonies, which were always there in the book. So cleaning up toxic waste, generally bad for your health.
Right, but the colonies in the book sort of were this this nightmare that you didn't want, but this makes them very real.
Yeah, so the difference between the television show and the book is that in the book we have only one narrative point of view, which is augmented at the end by the historical notes, but during the narrative we can only see what she can see. In the television series, we can follow characters that disappear from the view of the central narrator. We can follow them and see what happened to them, whereas she cannot.
Right.
So they've built out the cast of characters. They've taken the narrative, as it were, behind the scenes to places that the narrator could never go to in the book.
So are we going to find out what made Aunt Lydia what she is?
Oh, eventually. I think, in anybody's life, there are a series of choices that person can make. So what choices did the younger Aunt Lydia have offered to her? Or let us say, how did people end up in charge of nunneries in the Middle Ages? It was a powerful position.
Right.
Within a frame. You could only be powerful to this extent, but at least you were powerful within that sphere.
So, speaking of power, you have a button on that says,
It says,
After Me Too. What does that mean to you?
What is that? That is a movement in Canada. Canada is that cold place to the north.
Where we escape when things get really bad here.
When things get really bad here, you're all very welcome. And up to a point, we'll have a nice hot cup of tea for you. And as you've seen in the show, there's a little America up there.
Right.
Just as there was a little Norway in Toronto during World War II. So government in exile, if you like, is up there. And you can have a nice mattress in a church basement and some soup. But you don't have to do that yet. In fact, we're kind of hoping you don't. We're kind of hoping that you stay here and vote next time.
Okay, but after Me Too.
After Me Too. So there's Me Too, there's Time's Up, there's She Too. She Too is for women in other countries. And there's After Me Too, which is a Canadian thing that started, again, in the entertainment business, but aims for an ongoing structure that will provide, first of all, a safe place to report, and second, a fair process for all, including independent third-party professional investigators. So they've thought it through, and you can go online and look up After Me Too and read their 9-point report.
So the idea is to create more of a due process around
The idea is
complaints,
to create a number of things, including immediate support for sexual assault victims and survivors, like immediate support. You don't have to wait for counseling. So a number of those things, but including fair process. Due process is a legal term, and not all of these things are legal type cases. That is, they're not things that you could necessarily bring a criminal charge for. So fair process covers independent third-party investigation and ticks the box that says feminism and human rights don't have to be on opposite sides of the fence.
Okay, so you recently told Variety, and I'm not going to ask you about the dumb Star Wars thing.
Ask me about the dumb Star
Wars. No, this is more
thing.
interesting, I think, because I feel you recently told Variety right after 9/11 they hired a bunch of Hollywood screenwriters to tell them how the story might go next. Sci-fi writers are very good at this stuff, anticipating future events. I mean, we're at a point in America right now where it seems to me that none of the possible outcomes are plausible. And so I wonder, where do you think things go next?
Well, I'm about to say some of my sci-fi writer friends, and I will ask them. And I think it's always, first of all, there is no the future. There is no one the future. There are a number of possible futures, and which one we get is going to depend partly on what we do now. But we also know that you can have the future all laid out and predicted, and then something comes out of nowhere, and there goes your interesting plan. So there's a couple of ways of thinking about the future that are not very productive. And one of them is that progress is inevitable and just goes on, upwards and upwards, till you get to the wonderful, perfect place. That has never been true. It's not, and it's just an excuse for not doing anything. So it's all going to work out anyway, right? And the other one is everything is circular. You can't ever make any real progress because it all just keeps coming round again. And that's not true either. So I think the only thing that is true is that there are a number of different possibilities, and writing dystopias and utopias is a way of asking the reader the question, where do you want to live? And where you end up living is going to depend partly on what you do now, but there's always some wild cards. There's always some wild cards, some things that people don't see. They don't see the consequences of the choices that they're making. So any human technology has got a good side, a bad side, and a stupid side that you didn't anticipate.
Right. Do you think that, as far as I know, there's not been a human society that we're aware of where men and women were truly equal? I mean, I guess you hear about a couple anthropological exceptions.
Well, let's walk back in time.
So do you think we'll ever see one? Do you think that equality of men and women is a possibility in the modern world?
Okay, let's walk back in time just for a minute. So before wheat, before wheat arrived on the scene, in the days of hunters and gatherers, first of all, people were healthier. And second, so far as we know, they were more equal. And in the days of nomadic horse herders, there really were women who rode around on horseback wearing pants and shooting bows and arrows. So that's what the Greeks based the Amazons on. Wheat arrives, and a couple of things happen. Number one, you got a surplus, and therefore you can pay a standing army. And what is your standing army going to defend? It's going to defend the territory where you're growing the wheat. It gets very circular. And at that moment, we see women being fed less well than men. So men are getting meat and wheat, and women are only getting wheat and bone diseases. So you also want to produce a lot of children to help you grow the wheat. And I think that's when things went down the slippery slope. But we are now in a different age. We're in an age in which upper body strength to defend the wheat with your sword and armor and whatnot, that's not such a necessity anymore. Because guess what? Women can work a keyboard. Yeah. And also they have this thing called a brain. So in an age in which brains and keyboards are quite important, women get an edge again. They get a better position. So I think we are on the up from the moment when it was wheat, and it was nothing but wheat.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.